Germany today appears to be beaten. Hitler, out. Swastikas, gone. Nazi propaganda, off the air. Concentration camps, empty.
I did not have any hate. I didn't have any love. But I thought that bygones should be bygones. We should build a new world. And my attitude was to go ahead and not to worry about the past, but to worry about the future.
The Allied soldiers who fought their way into Germany 60 years ago were on a unique mission. A mission that echoes to this day. To build a successful democracy from the ruins of a defeated people and a defeated nation. But the building of democracy after any war is fraught with difficulties and dangers. What really happens to the victors when they occupy a country? And what really happens to the occupied?
You are not being sent into Germany as educators. You are soldiers on guard.
In a time when people have nothing to eat, and you have the best foods, where they have nothing to drink, and you have the most expensive liquor. This is a very dangerous corruption.
I came to Germany expecting that Germans were the enemy of America, and then I discovered, no, my enemy was still the same.
Every German is a potential source of trouble. Therefore, there must be no fraternization with any of the German people. The German people are not our friends.
None of these people deserved anything. They didn't deserve sympathy. They didn't deserve our help. All they needed, really, if I can use the phrase, a good kick up the arse.
You will not be friendly. You will be aloof, watchful, and suspicious. You will not associate with German men, women, or children. The problem now is future peace. That is your job in Germany.
But while many Allied soldiers were building democracy, others were damaging its very foundations. There was mass rape of German civilians, abuse of prisoners in secret interrogation camps, and the start of a Cold War that was to last for decades. This is the story of those 4 years, told by the occupiers and the occupied.
There was this mass of huts and bodies piled up in clear areas. Unbelievable. Absolutely. The mind boggles at what went on here.
Cyril Stotesbury was one of the first of the occupiers. He landed in Normandy on D-Day. In Belsen in April 1945, he witnessed the full horror of the Nazi regime.
And of course, the smell's gone, but that was overpowering smell of death, and in Normandy, you had the same sort of smell, but it was nothing like the smell that came from this place. This was so overpowering, you know, assaulted your nostrils, and something you couldn't get rid of for a long time. This terrible stench. If you can imagine looking at a big heap of rags, a mound of rags, you know, with you suddenly realise there was arms and legs sticking out, and heads, you know, and then you realise that this was human bodies thrown in heaps. And
What did you think?
well, initially, you know, you thought, well, crumbs, you know, these bloody Germans are just annihilating people, and they don't care. They're so callous that they simply do not care. And for a long time, you could never forgive them for this, you know. And the easiest thing to do was to blame all Germans, which was a bit unfair, really.
In early 1945, Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union fought their way into Germany after the worst genocide and the most bloody and brutal war in history. One which left more than 50 million dead. From the west, 90 British, American and Allied divisions, some 3 million men, were advancing rapidly. In the east, over 200 Russian divisions, more than 6.5 million soldiers, were storming into the heart of Europe.
We not only smashed up the towns, but smashed up the links between the towns. And at the finish, life in Germany just ran down like a clock. Place and time meant nothing.
Peter Sichel was an intelligence officer for the US Army who'd grown up in Germany and was Jewish. He returned to a homeland that had been obliterated.
It was like coming into a modern civilization that had been totally destroyed. It was like Armageddon. It really was. And it almost a feeling of the Last Judgment. It was horrific. And the people were, you know, the people had nothing to wear. They looked hungry. They looked haggard. They had these eyes which had no rest and couldn't look at each other. It was a horrific time.
Because the links between the people were smashed too. They were just left wandering, searching, looking for food, looking for their homes, looking for each other.
In German cities, there was a big notice board with pictures where possible. Have you seen this man? Last seen in Russia? Well, didn't come back. The Russians didn't send their prisoners home for 10, 12 years, something like that.
Ich suche meine Frau.
Ich suche meinen Mann.
Ich suche Frieda Windler, Königsberg.
Ich suche meine Frau, Elfriede Schulz, und Tochter Christa.
The whole continent was moving. There were people moving everywhere. There were Frenchmen going home and Austrians going home and Poles going home, I don't know what for. Dutchmen going home, Belgians going home, Danes, Norwegians, they were all over the continent. It took ages to really sort itself out.
The Allies feared that somewhere in this chaos of humanity were Hitler's most fanatical followers, ready to launch an armed insurgency against the forces of the occupation. The German army had been defeated, but surely the 1,000-year Reich hadn't just vanished.
We thought it was very possible that the Nazis had a plan to have guerrillas after the war to make our life difficult. And we expected something. We found when we got there was nothing. There was no underground. There were no terrorists killing people. There was no resistance, no sign of it whatsoever. And I don't think there was ever anywhere.
Violence was instead directed against Germans for the many crimes of the Nazis, in widespread, often indiscriminate revenge attacks. These scenes were witnessed by an American cameraman in southern Germany.
Some of the Nazis were committing suicide, alone and with their whole family. So the only thing Nazis were capable of was to commit suicide, but not to fight against the Allied troops.
Everybody was so worn out, so depressed, so poor, so lacking in food, so lacking in any hope, that there was absolutely no, the conditions weren't there for anybody to resist. And I don't think the will was there to resist. This was a total collapse, and everybody accepted it.
After Hitler's suicide in Berlin on April the 30th, the remnants of the Nazi government fled to the northern city of Flensburg. For 2 weeks after the end of the war, under the new Führer, Admiral Dönitz, they continued as a government without a country, until the Allies decided finally to arrest them all. But capturing one of the Nazi leaders was to provoke an extraordinary scandal, the daring seizure not of war criminals, but of the German crown jewels. On the 23rd of May 1945, Albert Speer, the Nazi Minister for Armaments, was arrested by British soldiers at Glucksburg Castle near Flensburg.
One morning I woke up and an officer was standing in front of my bed with a pistol, and he said,
"What's your name? Get out."
And then we looked out and we could see that the whole castle, the castle lake, was surrounded with tanks. And inside the castle, Tommies with Sten guns were rushing all about.
The soldiers not only captured Speer, they also found members of the German and Danish royal families.
That is the rooms where my grandparents were living in 45. This is now like a drawing room, and this was used as a bedroom. And here you see like a little cupboard in the wall, and as far as I know from my grandparents and my aunts, they were hiding the jewelry behind this place here.
That morning, £6 million worth of jewelry was stolen from Glucksburg Castle by British soldiers.
And we went out into the courtyard. And all the time the little Tommies were going in with small sacks and coming out with full ones. And they threw them on the lorry, and we didn't know what was going on. And Speer was taken away, and all the jewelry was gone.
It was one of the largest robberies in British military history. But the British soldiers didn't realize that the owners of the jewelry in Glucksburg had friends in high places. They were all related to the British royal family.
Yes, my grandfather then wrote a letter to the King of England to explain to him what was happening here and ask him to help to find out what was going on. And they did investigations, but I think they didn't find really anything, and nothing was found after that.
Nobody was ever prosecuted for the crime.
And every time we went out, the guard would ask us friendly, well, has your jewelry come back yet? And we'd say, no, because you pinched it. And then we'd all laugh. They were always very friendly. Just wonderful.
Yeah, Rhine crossing was quite a do. 2 days before, we had a parade with the Brigadier. Anyway, we had this parade. Right, he said, you know where we're going? Over the Rhine, into Germany. And I know what you're thinking. Rape, loot and pillage. No rape. So it gave us a free hand, really, didn't it?
For 19-year-old wireless operator Ron Levitt, the turmoil had its compensations.
Yeah, we were parked in a residential street which hadn't been knocked about very much. It was quite reasonable. I did a nice bit of looting there, actually. And down at the far corner was one of our fighting tanks, but all the time anybody got the chance to loot, they did. I mean, I walked into a very nice flat, which hadn't been bombed or anything, but I found a drawer with Dutch silver coins in it, Dutch kronen, and I thought, well, if they've been in Holland looting, it's about time I recovered some of it. So I took the coins and I unplugged the radio and wrapped the lead round it and tucked it under my arm, and off I went. There was, you know, all sorts of odds and ends we picked up. The whole reason for the advance across Germany being so fast was because we had to get there before the Control Commission arrived. But we stole everything on the way. I mean, it was chaos. It really was chaotic.
It was worse than chaos. Among the spoils of war were the German people themselves.
It was just kept quiet. Everybody knew that it had happened a lot, but you just kept quiet. We were the losers. Nobody was interested in what happened to us. At the time, it wasn't anything special, but we didn't talk about it. At school afterwards, we didn't talk about it. For years and years, we didn't talk about it. Only now can I talk about it.
In April 1945, Christa Ronke was living with her mother in Berlin. She was 15 years old.
And when the first Russians came, the combat troops, they came in and wanted to see everything. Asked about weapons and soldiers, looked at everything closely, didn't find anything, and were very friendly, and then just left. And then the next lot arrived. The next one took me outside straight away. My mother wanted to throw herself in front of me, but she was pushed back. And then they took me upstairs, and as I tried to defend myself, he showed me his gun. And then, when I came back down, I was, well, shocked, but I was just happy that I was still alive.
In the Soviet army, it was said, don't make so much fuss about this raping. The German woman in reality wanted.
The drunk ones were the worst. They said, woman come. They said it in German. Frau komm in German.
So I can only tell you what I witnessed. It did happen that women, when they saw a Red Army soldier, began to undress. They were so shocked that they thought that this has to be. And such things happened. But this is, of course, has nothing to do with that they want it. But they were completely, it was a hopeless situation.
Nobody knows the precise figures, but one estimate was that around 100,000 women were raped by the Soviet army in Berlin.
You couldn't defend yourself. We were the booty, because we'd done a lot to the Russians during the war. A lot of bad things, and the hatred of the Russians was very great. We were the prize. It was always like that.
Das war nun mal so.
German women were raped in their thousands throughout the country. And not just by Russians. Other Allied soldiers were serial rapists too. It's still a taboo subject. Some of the worst cases were perpetrated by the Free French Army near Stuttgart in southwest Germany.
It was a steamroller of blood and horror and misery that can only be compared to the 30 Years' War.
In 1945, Erhard Ellwanger was a young army doctor at this castle near Stuttgart. It had been converted into an emergency hospital and dealt with hundreds of local rape victims of the French.
You just felt resigned, in despair and frightened. And the tragedy is that lots of women and girls were raped, mostly by troops from the French colonies. Many women just cried for days. Also young girls, these were 14-year-old girls, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old girls. But then most of all, the ones who were a bit older, who already had boyfriends, who were newly married, they were in despair, of course, in absolute despair.
The women of Germany felt completely abandoned.
At that time, I used to write my diary every day. I don't know why. I had to write everything down. I didn't have any close friends I could talk to. My mother was very nice, but she too had experienced the worst, and for her it was particularly bad.
About 6 to 8 weeks later, a lot of women and girls realized that in addition to the calamity of rape, they had also become pregnant. And now, they just didn't know what to do.
Many women committed suicide. Others tried to get rid of the baby themselves. Although abortion was still strictly illegal in Germany, the doctors decided it was their duty to help.
There was no anesthetic, of course. And if there were already 2 to 3 month-old fetuses there, then that used to be very difficult indeed.
The mass rape of German women was just one terrible aspect of the devastation in the aftermath of Hitler's war on civilization. What had been the most modern nation in Europe lay in total ruins. Millions of its people left homeless and utterly traumatized. The Germans called it Stunde Null, 0 hour. Out of all this killing, chaos and confusion, was any order possible? Was there any future for Germany?
Don't let me be split to the Germans when our victory is ultimately won.
The Allies divided Germany into 4 zones of occupation. In the British zone, Field Marshal Montgomery became commander-in-chief.
Let's be meek to them and turn the other cheek.
Initially, there were good contacts and mutual respect. And for a brief period, the wartime alliance lived on, at least in public.
But don't let's be split to the Hun.
The plan was to denazify, decentralize, and democratize Germany, and, crucially, to run it as a single country. Berlin itself, situated deep in the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors and administered jointly by the Allies. For many Berliners, the arrival of Westerners couldn't come soon enough.
But don't let's be split to the Hun.
Americans move into Berlin to take over their zone of occupation in cooperation with the English, French, and Russians. The Yanks march in front of the Adolf Hitler barracks, they watch the Allied flags raised over the former Nazi citadel.
They came on July the 1st, 1945. We were longing for them to come. We were just happy that the Russians had gone. And we all watched closely as they arrived. It was for us, well, soldiers from America. America was a dreamland for us. You just couldn't imagine it. They were amazing, rich, and they just looked so relaxed, friendly somehow.
The most fascinating part was that I discovered that Germans had been systematically taught that all descendants of Africans had tails. And so what it did, it developed a curiosity, an overriding curiosity in the women folk. And they, well, wait a minute, how does this work? And so one thing leads to another. And no, the anatomy is the same.
The US troops who arrived at Berlin's Tempelhof airport discovered a Germany whose economy had all but collapsed. When Peter Sichel arrived as a young Secret Service officer, he found his unit totally distracted from their job.
The main purpose was to head a unit of about 7 or 8 intelligence officers, whose job was basically to find scientists, technicians, former high-ranking Nazis or Gestapo or SS officials. And the unit hadn't done that. They were involved in buying and selling things and making money on the black market.
Near Berlin's battered Reichstag, black market deals and primitive barter spring to life. Russians are reported to have paid £100 for watches, and cameras were a favorite object for haggling.
Everything was available, from cigarettes and coffee to morphine and cocaine. Fantastic amounts of money were there to be made. In July 1945, the US Army in Berlin distributed $1 million in pay, yet US servicemen sent over 3 times as much back home.
And it was a national sport. I mean, the temptation was extraordinary. When here we were at the end of the war, we all had gone through a rather difficult period, and here was a way to make money. And you had to be very highly motivated just to stay away from it.
I would send all my paycheck and the cigarette money. I would send that home to my mother. She was able to buy a home as a result of my sending her that money.
They say with a few cartons of cigarettes to start with, you get rich over there in no time. Yeah, and with just a few packs of cigarettes, you can pick up any fur line in Germany. Okay, okay.
I just wanted my officers to work at least 8 hours a day on doing their job. What they did afterwards, I didn't care. But I didn't want them to have, at their main job, visiting the Tiergarten and exchanging things for cigarettes, etc. And we cleaned up and got new officers and did our job.
And Peter Sichel's job was to be a spy master. In no other city on Earth did the Allies live so close to each other. In no other city on Earth was there so much intelligence to be had.
All the Western powers had intelligence services. And the Americans had a counterintelligence corps, they had an army intelligence, they had a navy intelligence, they had an air force intelligence, they had us at the OSS. You can combine that with the Russian services, the British services, the French services. It was a whorehouse. It was a whorehouse, meaning that there were hundreds of people willing to sell any type of information. You asked what you wanted, you got it. And it wasn't, 99% of the time, it was not the truth.
In 1945, Peter Sichel was working for the forerunner of the CIA, the OSS, here at the headquarters for US intelligence in Berlin. His team spied not just on Germans, but on the Allies too.
Life was very intense. For one thing, we were extremely busy because there was a lot of detailed work to be done that had to be supported by getting safe houses where we could meet agents, to find dead drops where they could leave information which we picked up, to have surveillance teams in order to check out the agents. Intelligence is like police work, a lot of very boring, detailed work. If you don't do your work, you're likely to get into a lot of trouble. I mean, a lot of people who sell intelligence sell it in order to further their own political goals. Every group in Germany had some interest in having us see certain things in a certain way.
The main focus for Western intelligence was not the hunt for Nazis, but activities in the Soviet zone. In the ruins of Berlin, the Russians were quick to establish a functioning political administration. And unlike the Western Allies, they deliberately used Germans in positions of political influence. On the day Hitler committed suicide in Berlin, 10 German communists had been flown into the city from Moscow to help reorganize the new German state. The sole survivor of that group is Wolfgang Leonhard.
That's it. That's it. It's incredible.
The political rebirth of the city of Berlin began here at number 41 Einbeckerstraße.
We arrived here on the 8th of May. Our task was, in the first place, to build up civil administration in all the 20 districts of Berlin.
Leonhard's group were ordered to get their people into key positions before the Western Allies got to Berlin. They started the first radio station and newspaper in post-war Germany. But despite the appearance of openness, they were to keep control.
Always said, don't mind, it must look democratic, but we must have everything in our hands. And so I had the difficulty to find a bourgeois mayor. And suddenly somebody with a tie came, a bourgeois. So I said, excuse me, but would you like to become mayor of Wilmersdorf? Well, not really. I mean, I'm more trading with cattle. But I know somebody for you. And there I found a man, and after 20 minutes I decided that's the man to become mayor of Wilmersdorf. So I was in the unusual position, being 24 years old, 3 days in Germany, and appointing mayors. I never had that in my life anymore again.
The British were torn between the desire to punish the Germans and the desire to reform them. They set up a control commission to run the British zone. But unlike the Russians, they adopted a far more distant approach towards the German people. British officials were specifically instructed to be cold, curt, and aloof. 20 million Germans were to be kept firmly in their place. It was a policy almost designed to alienate the very people they were trying to reform.
Well, we were there to keep the peace, but the Control Commission came along with the job of converting Germany to democracy.
British administration in Germany reflected all the best aspects of local government back home and brought a mass of red tape. In order to do virtually anything in Germany, you needed a chit, written permission, preferably in triplicate. Traveling away from home, getting supplies, teaching at a school, publishing a book, playing music in public. Almost everything had to be officially approved. It was a sprawling bureaucracy.
The Germans took over more, and yet the Control Commission didn't seem to slim down. It was hopelessly overstaffed, I think.
In 1946, it took 25,000 bureaucrats to administer the British zone. The Americans got by with just 5,000.
Yes, they were a mixed lot. I don't think it was a job that would have appealed to anybody with very firm principles. Yes, I think there were certain people, I think the expression is, had an eye to the main chance, and they took full advantage of it. And this was at a time when the Germans had nothing.
Over this shattered landscape, the world's first superpowers began the struggle for power in Europe. America had come out of the war with its industry intact, and with the unprecedented power of the atom bomb. The Soviet Union, exhausted by the war with Hitler, had nothing to match the American military machine, but they had an endless appetite for politics. The Western Allies discouraged political activity in their sectors, but in the Russian zone it was different. Already by the summer of 1945, 4 political parties had been founded in the Soviet zone: conservative, liberal, socialist, and communist, all ostensibly independent of Moscow. It gave hope of a limited freedom under Soviet rule. A Berlin Spring.
I think that Stalin at that time meant it seriously to permit a multi-party system, to permit some freedom for the non-communists, to give a little bit more freedom. I think he meant it seriously, because at that time he did not intend to have a communist East Germany, but hoped to have a united Germany with a certain Soviet influence, and he was ready for that aim to make certain concessions.
There was a very much higher class of Russian officer in Germany. A lot of them spoke German, and they were very clever in getting to know Germans, and they were not bad. There was just, politically, they wanted to control it all.
I was very hopeful that in Germany we can do it another way, and we will have a little bit freedom to do it our way, and that was my big hope.
But just how long could the Berlin Spring last? While the Allies were building their political machines, they also set about dismantling German war industries. Never again would Germany be allowed the industrial muscle to start a new war in Europe. But one factory was spared. And in the summer of 1945, a British major, Ivan Hurst, was sent to inspect it.
I was a very young man. My brief was very simply just to go to Wolfsburg and find the factory and sit on it.
That factory was Volkswagen. It was the British Army that saved the German motor industry and rebuilt a company that went on to produce 100 million vehicles. Colonel Michael McAvoy, one of Hurst's superior officers, knew the Volkswagen car from before the war and was keen to see it produced again.
He had the bright idea that if we could get the factory into operation, it would provide the light transportation that the army and military government required for running the British zone of Germany.
The plan was for Germany to pay for the cars as part of the cost of the occupation.
we found at the factory a beetle and sent it up to Royal Army headquarters as a demonstrator.
To Hearst's astonishment, the British authorities ordered 20,000 cars straight away. But could so many be built under the conditions of the time? Within a month, he had another headache. The order had doubled.
An order for the cars was one thing, to produce them was another matter. Conditions were very grim. The big presses were there, damaged but repairable.
Getting supplies was a constant struggle. Some parts had to be smuggled out from other zones in exchange for alcohol and cigarettes. Others had to be made from scratch in the factory.
I think the feeling was not never make it, but what a hell of a job in front of us.
The British motor industry was hardly encouraging. Sir William Rootes, one of Britain's leading car magnates, reckoned the whole project would collapse within 2 years. He told Hearst, "If you think you're going to build cars in this place, you're a bloody fool, young man." And a British Army technical study said the Volkswagen did not meet the basic requirements of a car. But Major Hearst battled on. He decided to boost morale by actually involving the workers in running their factory. Within 2 months, they had built 1,000 cars. By October 1946, they had built 10,000 vehicles. It was a remarkable achievement.
It was far in advance of anything I'd seen. They handled beautifully on the very, very damaged roads. And they were quite lively. They were, I think, an excellent car.
I loved driving the Volkswagen. It was responsive, it was unconventional. You could really push it, but the handling was colossal. I mean, you could really throw the little thing about.
Curiously enough, the military police didn't have them as soon as we did. And if the military police were likely to have caught you doing something you shouldn't, you could accelerate away from them, and they couldn't keep in the Jeep if they kept up with you. So they had their advantages.
The British had found one way to work with their old enemy, and they needed others. In Hamburg, they took over the airwaves that had served Nazi propaganda.
This is the British Forces Network.
Well, look, this is the story. The other day we were sitting in the Naffy, just opened in Hamburg, having char and a wad, when we rubbed our eyes and nearly toppled off our chairs in amazement. There, large as life, were English.
This new station, formed from detachments from BLA 2 and 4, came into use as a powerful voice, covering the troops engaged in disarming the German...
I was sent to Hamburg to join the British Forces Network. We ran a broadcasting service for the British forces in Germany. We were largely staffed technically by Germans. All the recording engineers were Germans.
Then again, on countless occasions, we've worked alongside German orchestras and artists. Juan Losses, the Karl Rading Sextet, and Georgovich's Rhythm Boys. Do you recall the lovely tones of Georgovich's violin?
The relationship between the British and the Germans in the Control Commission and in BFN was very close. Inescapably, it had to be to work.
And in the US zone too, relations between the Allies and the German people were getting more cordial. In Berlin, Christa Ronke worked in a canteen for American officers.
At the beginning, I was pretty serious. The officers were all distant, and they were our former enemies. And I didn't smile when I was serving. I had to pour cocoa and coffee and tea. One of the officers complained, and I was told I had to keep smiling. Smile, smile. So I learned just how to be like that, and so I stayed there. They wanted smiling. They didn't want serious.
Ernst wollten sie nicht haben.
Of course, the ban was finally lifted, but you can't change a hero. He may go for temporary amusements, but he still yearns for the girl he left behind. Even though it certainly doesn't look like it in these fascinating scenes where Joe gets a few well-earned days' rest after bearing down on the vicious Nazi.
With no work and little food, a relationship with an Allied soldier was often the only way for many women and their families to survive.
We've done our best, but oh, to be a conquering hero.
They're all called Ami-Mädchen, Ami girls. They weren't well liked because you knew they just sold themselves for something to eat. At the time, they weren't well liked, but now it's different. But then, it was a bit uncomfortable. I was brought up that you didn't do that sort of thing with men you hardly knew. Who knows what they'd get up to?
I saw mothers instructing their daughters to become prostitutes, and to see people having to give up all of their dignity out of the desperation caused by the war. That was just absolutely appalling.
Well, there were very few men in Germany. They were all in prisoner of war camps or they were dead. So there were a lot of young women and a lot of young men of a different nation who got together rather fast. There was supposed to be a ban on fraternisation, but it didn't work.
There were no German men, and maybe there's a handsome American. So, why not? And then they'd get something to eat, and nylons and everything else. It'd be very nice. But they weren't well liked, these Ami girls.
I mean, human nature being what it is, all these women in Germany without men and all these men without women, so it's automatic, isn't it?
There were lots of very pretty girls, yes. And lots of very pretty girls. We were at first not permitted to fraternize. And, but that broke down very quickly, and we certainly had lots of parties with lots of very pretty girls. When peace broke out, we all lived very intensely, having survived. We ate a lot, we drank a lot, we fraternized a lot, we loved a lot, we had lots of fun.
In Berlin's massive Olympic Stadium, troops of the British Occupation Army stage a military tattoo. Before thousands of German children, 2,500 soldiers from all parts of the British zone lead a revival of a colourful spectacle that in pre-war days thrilled British audiences.
The problem of eradicating Nazi ideology remained. In 1946, Don Ray was a British sergeant pursuing Nazis in Cologne.
I was in field security. The task that we were supposed to do was to arrest certain categories of German. But of course, everything in Germany was permeated by the Nazi organization.
8.5 million people, Germans and Austrians, had been members of the Nazi Party.
Every member of the German civilian, I suppose over a certain age, had a Fragebogen, a big questionnaire to fill in to prove whether or not they were Nazis, but I never found one. No, there were no Nazis whatsoever.
A Nazi mass murder of Polish Jews in a forest near Nuremberg.
The Allies confronted the Germans with gruesome evidence of the atrocities committed in their name.
Germans of Nuremberg are compelled by Allied commanders to give the murdered victims a funeral. Women must help, and so must boys. Through the streets of Nuremberg, degraded as the Nazi shrine city, the grim procession passes. The inhabitants made to pay funeral honors to victims of Nazi barbarism.
Nuremberg, site of the vast Nazi rallies before the war, was also where the leading Nazis faced Allied justice. It was the first time in history that members of a defeated government faced trial for crimes against humanity.
Recording, there goes attention. Attention has been called. Recording, attention, attention.
But it dragged on for 11 long months.
The cinemas were full, and the only thing that used to amuse me about the German cinemas, I'd go to the films, and the newsreel would come up, and people would watch, and then the war crimes trials in Nuremberg would come on, and there was a concerted groan from the audience. They were fed up to the teeth with this. I think, personally, that most people, the average German, if there is such a thing, was fed up to the teeth with the Nazis, and above all, of course, just glad that the war had ended. In November 1946, only 11 of the major Nazis were sentenced to death at Nuremberg. 3 were acquitted, and the rest given lengthy prison terms. But it wasn't an end to the search for justice. Over the next 50 years, more than 3,500 Nazis would stand trial in Germany for the terrible crimes they had committed. For many of the victims, waiting for the courts was not going to help. They needed a different approach to deal with the past.
The Germans, what can I tell you? I have no words to describe really feelings like that.
Leah Fischer spent 4 years in Nazi ghettos and concentration camps. Apart from her mother, she was the only survivor from her entire family.
Nobody was left. My whole family was gone. They had children, they had babies. Not one person survived. How could you be only angry? It's above anger, above hate. You felt like you're numb.
My father and his entire generation was eaten up by hate, and understandably so. My father was a very prominent member of a medium-sized German city, very respected, and he had to leave that city with a little suitcase from one day to another illegally in order to save his life. But he was consumed by hate. And I had a long talk with him in about 46 or 47. And I said, you must come to Germany, you must see what happened, you must bury the hate, otherwise it will kill you.
I really cannot remember feeling real hatred. And I'm surprised, because the things they did to us, if it would be in the normal times like now, okay, if somebody did something bad to me, I get angry. There was no anger, because you know why? Because it didn't work, it didn't help.
You cannot live with hate, because it eats you up. A hate is a hate against yourself. If you hate other people, you hate yourself as well. And my father didn't first understand that. But after he buried his hate, he understood it. Because he lived with it all the time.
Many of the surviving Jews, having lost everything, found refuge in camps in Germany itself. One of the largest Jewish camps was in Feldafing in Bavaria, in a former school for the Hitler Youth. It was a place where Jews and Germans learnt once more to be neighbors. Anton Flossmann was a local carpenter.
Before the war, we'd had this Nazi school here, which had been a big bother for Feldafing. And then the war was over, and the trade-off was, we had a camp for, well, how do you call them? They were Jews. 6,000 of them in Feldafing. They were Polish Jews, and I think from up in the north, Lithuania, some from Latvia, and some Germans.
It looked beautiful to us. It was clean linen, regular normal beds. It seemed like a dream come true, except for one thing. I was depressed. I felt, I don't know why. I can still not understand. I thought I'm going to be so happy and so elated that I'm liberated, I'm free. I fell into a depression, maybe the shock, the transfer from this horrors, from all this starvation and beatings and things like that. And all of a sudden I felt that I am on my own. I am free and I can do whatever I want. Maybe this was too much.
And then they got, I'm not sure whether it was from England or America, but they got food, and a lot of it. And the people from Feldafing went to buy things from them. A lot of deals were done.
They started sending us care packages from this country. They started sending clothes, food, shoes. So we were very happy with it, of course, and we used this as like money, actually, to barter from the Germans to get other things. My mother went the first time into town and bought a little chicken. That was the first one we had in like 5 years. I did not have to deal with any Germans, actually, except go to a restaurant, or everybody was very courteous. After the war, they were very nice to us.
I don't know of any case where there was any sort of problem. I have to say, we didn't have any bad impression of these people at all. I, for one, I always got on well with them.
2 months after her liberation, Leah left Feldafing and Germany to start a new life in Czechoslovakia with her new husband.
Our life mattered to us. We wanted to rebuild our lives. I was walking and there was a big parade, Partisans Day they called it, and all of a sudden I heard in the Czech language, Slovak language, they said, Židi do Dunaja. It meant the Jews into the Danube. So this, when I heard that, it was like somebody would stick a knife in my chest. I said, after what we went through, I said to my husband, I don't care if you give me a palace, I don't want to stay here. I'm going back to Germany.
By the end of 1946, the creation of a functioning democracy in the ruins of Nazi Germany was moving steadily forward. But what happened next threatened to derail the entire project. It was said that when the occupation zones were allocated, the Russians got the food, the French got the wine, the Americans the scenery, and the British got the ruins. More people lived in the British zone than in any other. Living conditions for many were already very poor. And by the winter of 1946, the situation in the British zone was reaching crisis point.
I came back to Cuxhaven from England, and you could see huge chunks of ice floating in the sea.
The first winter was bad, and the second winter was a killer. The second winter was one of the worst winters I've ever lived through. It was extremely cold. There was a lot of snow and a lot of ice, and people were frozen to death.
It was a bitter cold winter, and we were trying to keep warm, and we were trying to get enough to eat because our rations were very short. We just about got enough to live on.
And there were people literally dropping in the streets in Hamburg.
The ground was frozen so deep that graves had to be dug with explosives.
it was a not uncommon sight to see someone just crumble up as a result of starvation, deprivation, cold, nowhere to live.
In the big cities, especially in the bombed-out big cities, there was pure starvation. The ration coupons that existed after the war sank to under 1,000 calories per day, and serious malnutrition starts at about 1,200 for adults.
Food was very short and fuel was very short. Even though apparently Lintfort's got one of the biggest coal mines in the Ruhr, we couldn't get any coal.
Britain was running out of money to pay for the upkeep of their zone. The harvest had failed, food rations were falling, and coal production was in rapid decline. In Hamburg, 1,000 people were arrested for stealing coal in December. By March, 17,000 people were charged with the same offence. The Archbishop of Cologne even pardoned his flock if they stole food and coal in order to stay alive. Hugh Dalton, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, said, "We cannot continue to carry this mounting burden any longer." For the first time, there were demonstrations against the occupying powers. For the first time, the Allies were in danger of losing control. It was a desperately serious situation, the worst of the occupation so far. Then, in early 1947, British and American security forces arrested hundreds of people they said were organizing a Nazi resistance movement. The British claimed that one group even had access to bacteriological weapons and were threatening to devastate the whole of Western Europe if their demands were not met. Don Ray was involved in the arrests and took one of the suspects to a secret interrogation center run by British intelligence in northern Germany.
I was to take a body, as they said, to the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center at Bad Nendorf, which was a complete village wired off. The whole place was run like a punishment center, I think. The guards were ordinary squaddies, and they were isolated as well. What an isolated village, wired off, and communications were poor.
One of the warders at Bad Nendorf was Cyril Stotesbury.
These would have been cells.
He was sent there just months after witnessing the horrors of Belsen. This is the first time he's been back in 60 years.
We were told that the people we'd be dealing with were the people that were responsible for a lot of the atrocities that had gone on in the country, you know. Whether that was true or not, we didn't know. Every single German at that time that we met, we would treat it and tar them with the same brush. One of them had cut his hand deliberately, and with his blood had marked a big cross on the back of his cell, and used to spend hours kneeling down there praying. The mind boggled, really. Don't forget, we weren't privy to the details of each prisoner. The easy assumption was that these guys had been guilty of carrying out things that we'd seen at Belsen.
But what the warders had been told wasn't true. Although some of the inmates at Bad Nendorf were indeed SS officers, others were completely innocent. One of them was a 36-year-old dentist, Adolf Gahler.
My father was never a member of the Nazi Party. My father was truly innocent. I can say that with 100% certainty. He just wasn't the type for things that were not legal. I know he said that many, almost all of the people there were innocent.
At Bad Nendorf, the prisoners were not interrogated about war crimes. They were interrogated to get information on the alleged Nazi underground and on the intelligence services of the Soviet Union. Few, if any, of the prisoners were ever brought to trial.
The most important thing is to be brought before a court. And my father-in-law wasn't. All of them weren't in Bad Nenndorf. My father-in-law told me it wasn't legal. The British government knew nothing about what went on. It was just down to a few brutal gangsters acting off their own bat.
The detailed interrogation centre was commanded by a former MI5 officer, Colonel Robin Stevens. According to Colonel Stevens, the prime qualification for working at Bad Nenndorf was the ability to hate Germans.
They were treated harshly. Prisons aren't built for comfort, you know, and this one certainly wasn't, you know.
Adolf Galler's record shows that after 4 months in Bad Nenndorf, he weighed less than 5.5 stone. He had lost more than half his body weight. He was taken to Rotenburg Internment Hospital, where he was found to be suffering from 2nd and 3rd degree frostbite and severe malnutrition. He was barely alive.
He was a broken man. You couldn't recognize him. I knew how he had been before, and there was just no comparison.
Adolf Galler was not alone. A stream of filthy, malnourished prisoners began arriving at Rotenburg Hospital and at other internment camps nearby. Several of them died within days as a direct result of their treatment at the interrogation centre. Many British officers were deeply concerned. Something was seriously wrong. And soon allegations of prisoner abuse began to emerge. The army launched an internal inquiry. Scotland Yard investigated, and 3 officers, including the commandant, faced court-martial. What happened in Bad Nenndorf was kept a secret not only from the outside world, but even from the warders themselves.
I'm only one individual, but as far as I'm concerned, never on my shift, if you like, did it happen. I was never given orders to beat a prisoner. I was never given orders to strike a prisoner, and I certainly would have never beaten one up. I don't think I would have done any right, you know, I'd have been told to do so.
Many of the official papers in the case are a state secret in Britain even today, 60 years later. But for the first time, this program has gained access to the secret records of the Scotland Yard inquiry. These papers confirm that the British knew that some prisoners were physically abused and ill-treated at Bad Nenndorf. The abuse, Scotland Yard found, was inhuman, unnecessary, and unwarranted.
I found him sitting naked on the floor and started slapping him again.
These men have been subjected to a certain amount of violence.
We questioned him and started slapping him again.
Knocked his chin with his hand, so I went on slapping.
There was brutality of a kind which was absolutely forbidden to use at Bad Nenndorf.
Questions were asked in Parliament, and the government became deeply uneasy about the full details of the case becoming known. Despite all the evidence of physical abuse at Bad Nenndorf, at his court-martial, Colonel Stevens was acquitted. He was later even promoted. 10 years later, the British government paid Adolf Galler £150,000 at today's prices in compensation for his treatment at Bad Nenndorf.
This arrest destroyed my family, even up to today. Something like this stays with you for a lifetime, doesn't it? Your father is always your father.
But there's one last twist in the story. The secret government papers also reveal that no bacteriological weapons ever existed, and there was no effective Nazi underground either. All the intelligence reports had been completely fabricated. But while the British were brutalizing German prisoners in one hidden corner of Germany, back in Britain, they were actually trying to reform them, re-educating former German soldiers in the benefits of tolerance and democracy. At the elegant country house of Wilton Park near London, German prisoners of war attended courses and lectures in how to think for themselves. For many, it was a startling new idea.
I had never heard the word tolerant before, although I had gone to secondary school or the grammar school. The word was not discussed in Germany, and there they tried to encourage tolerance.
Some 4,000 German prisoners in Britain were chosen to attend Wilton Park. Werner Thom was one of them.
We got the impression that we were now regarded as people, and the fact that they discussed their own opinions with us, former enemies, well, that impressed me enormously.
That process of learning democracy is preserved by these wall posters produced at Wilton Park by the German prisoners themselves.
Nothing was indoctrinated. We were just left to form our own opinions. Under Hitler, whatever the Führer said was the truth, and it was not questioned. And that was a very important experience that I learned, to ask questions and analyze things. It was wonderful. Certainly the most important time in my life. I certainly have not experienced another 7 weeks like that were as important and which changed me so much.
For 12 long years, German life and culture had been totally subjected to the needs of Nazi propaganda. But with the end of the war, a new cultural rebirth became possible, a new sense of freedom. And for many in the 40s, freedom meant jazz. Hans Otto Jung and his fellow fans couldn't wait to meet actual American jazzmen.
Yeah, it was great fun, yeah. The American musicians were the experts that really could, we wanted to learn from them by playing with them.
Some of the most influential jazzmen to be found were from a US Army band on the Frankfurt Air Force Base.
The 427th Army Band, they liked to jam with us, and there were a lot of real good musicians in that band. McIntosh, for instance, was a trombonist.
Tom McIntosh was originally a laundryman in the US Army when he discovered he had a gift for music. He started out playing trombone in the 427th US Army Band.
I remember one German musician in particular coming up to me, says, McIntosh, I certainly loved your chorus on T for Two. And I said, oh my goodness, I'm just learning how to play.
I played piano at that time, played a little jazz for them, and they liked it so much that they asked my band to entertain them on the weekends.
So here they are playing the hits of the day, in the mood, you know, which is the way it was done in America. They say, and we would sit and just crack up laughing.
Of course, I was an amateur, you know, I was not a professional. So we got quite a lot of experience and loved it.
Well, guess what? In no time at all, a cadre of German musicians started to come to the fore, and these guys were superb. There was a girl by the name of Jutta Hipp. I mean, what a great jazz name. She was beautiful, but she could play her buns off.
Oh, we had a feeling of getting free, getting more freedom, yeah.
Black musicians enjoyed a freedom in Germany that they couldn't find in a deeply segregated America. For the first time, they had access to classical music and were given classical training.
Where the Baltimore Symphony played, there was a sign in it, whites only. And I just felt privileged, absolutely privileged to be a part of this whole European classical music thing, for which I've always been told this is the epitome, but you're not welcome. That was a no man's land for blacks.
Things really were beginning to change. By mixing with Germans, the occupiers began to lose some of the hatred built up from the war.
You began to realize that these were human beings who had faced the same problems that our folk back home had faced, you know. And they had come through probably experiences worse than us, because they were in a regime which they couldn't speak freely, they couldn't criticize, and they couldn't discuss matters, you know. And you began to realize that it was fear that had driven them, fear of the authorities. And in a way, you sensed that perhaps they were a bit relieved. You know, not nice to have your country taken over, and I believe the British soldier had a better relationship than the other occupying forces.
But the country was far from stable. With mounting hunger and deprivation in the West, there was a real fear that some in Germany were finding the certainties of communism much more attractive. In April 1946, the Soviet Union announced the merger of the socialist and communist parties in their zone. In Berlin, many social democrats wondered if it was just a cynical trick, or whether the future now really did lie in their own hands. It was a turning point in the history of the Soviet occupation, and it took place here, in the Admiralspalast Theater in Berlin.
I was 25 years old, full of vigor, full of hope. It's not as easy that either you are adherent or you are oppositional. Very often you have both things more or less simultaneously, and that was how I felt. There was a hope that this would be a new party. The people who voted here did not have in mind the later dictatorship. When here it was voted, it was a party which promised to be in favor of a parliamentary democracy with all freedoms of the population and no copying of the Soviet Union. There was no Lenin and Stalin. It gave hope, and the real problem was that this hope was so quickly destroyed. 3 years later, 10 of the 14 leaders were sacked, some even arrested, and only 4 remained. Everybody else was gone.
It was a very simple world, you know. We were the good guys and they were the bad guys. And we had a job to do, and we all were afraid that the Russians were going to take Western Europe. So we were highly motivated.
The Soviet Union tightened its grip on its zone. In the spring of 1947, arrests of political opponents reached their peak. Soviet dismantling of East German industry continued apace. It was estimated that almost 2/3 of the Soviet zone's industrial capacity was removed to the USSR as war reparations. The situation within Germany was changing rapidly. In 1947, with the economy stalling and the alliance fragmenting, Britain and the United States merged their zones of occupation over the protests of the French and the Russians. It was an outright break with previous agreements to treat Germany as a single country and a single economy. But by January 1948, there was more economic crisis, more industrial unrest, and strikes in the Ruhr. The economy had to be stabilized, and stabilized quickly. In June, a new convertible currency was introduced, the Deutschmark. It had a spectacular effect. The shops filled up overnight, and the black market rapidly went out of business. But there was a heavy price to pay.
I think what broke the back was the currency, the currency reform, where suddenly there was a difference economically between the West and the East.
Stalin reacted immediately. He didn't want the old worthless Reichsmark flooding into the Soviet zone. 4 days later, the Russians closed off all land access to the western sectors of Berlin. The only way in now was by air. But 2.5 million people still lived in the western sectors of the city, and they all needed fuel, food, and power. It was the first time the conflict between the Russians and the Western powers had broken out into open confrontation. For many, it was the true start of the Cold War.
When the Russians closed the Autobahn and the rail links to Berlin, that was almost a declaration of war.
At the beginning, I was still working for the Americans. They were all on a red alert. And, well, it was very unsettling. We wondered what was going to happen next.
In America, in the American government, there was a great discussion on the subject if Berlin should be abandoned for purely strategic reasons. I mean, it was a drain on resources. It was indefensible militarily.
Would we now become Russian? Would the Americans leave Berlin? Or would they come with their tanks and break the blockade, which would have meant war? And that would have been just as bad. Or could they supply us by air? But at the beginning, we didn't think they could.
Ein Lied aus der Prärie. Wait for the wagon.
Will you come with me, my Phyllis dear, to yon blue mountain free, where the blossoms smell the sweetest? Come, rove along with me. It's every Sunday morning, dear, when I am by your side. We'll hop into the wagon and off we will ride. Wait for the wagon, wait for the wagon, wait for the wagon, and we'll all take a ride.
Once one landed in Berlin, it would have been quite impossible to escape the excitement and feeling of relief of tension which surrounded those airfields. The Germans unloading the aircraft, working flat out.
Wait for the wagon, wait for the wagon, and we'll all take a ride.
It just worked brilliantly. Amazing. We got everything we needed. Dried food, dehydrated vegetables, dehydrated everything. But we didn't starve.
The blockade of Berlin lasted for 11 long months. During that time, nearly 300,000 flights brought 2.5 million tons of supplies into Berlin.
wagon. Wait for the
During Easter of 1949, they were landing at the rate of 1 every minute. And the Russians did nothing to stop them.
The Berlin airlift was a quite remarkable achievement. Without that, there would have been war. I truly believe.
But the Russians were bluffing.
My information showed me that the Russians had no logistic build-up to go further. They did not have the munitions or the units, army units, or the transport and everything else which was needed in order to go and run over West Germany. It was an almost poker-like attempt to do something which might, if it had worked out their way, gotten them something which was worth a great deal. If we would have abandoned Berlin, it would have had an enormous influence on the post-war world.
Were the occupiers still enemies then?
No, then they became real friends. We were all in the same boat. We really liked them a lot. We were very grateful that they remained here, and then they really became our friends.
It was pretty close. It was pretty close. If we had had another winter in 48, 49, like we had in 46, 47, it would have been the end. We had a very mild winter. And I grew all the vegetables I ate.
The success of the airlift was the end of all hope of a united Germany. 2 weeks later, the Federal Republic, West Germany, was founded from the British, American and French occupation zones. And in October, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, was founded in the Soviet zone. Democracy, or at least the form of democracy that each of the Allies understood, had been brought to Germany not only through chaos and force of arms, but also by ingenuity and idealism. Despite all the difficulties, in 4 years, Germany had been transformed.
We were just happy that the damn Nazis had gone, and democracy was greatly appreciated.
To watch the rebuilding and to watch the place come to life was an extraordinary experience. We felt the pulse of the great heart of Germany beating more strongly and more strongly.
Yes, I enjoyed Germany. Yeah, great. Yeah, even in that winter when it was so cold.
It was only when you got to know Germans, you got a shock. You found that they thought and acted very much as we do.
Somehow, having seen the punishment which was visited on the Germans, made it possible to say they have paid for it. We all believe that the criminals should be punished, but you cannot punish everybody. You cannot have a guilt spread over everybody.
Next week, Emperor Hirohito and Japan, and victory and defeat for Sir Winston Churchill after the war next Tuesday and Wednesday at 9 here on BBC Two.